In the organisational field, as in all the fields, there is this lovely way of being able to pull together all the red threads and to walk into any client encounter in any type of situation and go, wow, I've got all this multitude of TA thinking that I can draw upon. I'm not following a formula. It's like what seems most relevant, most applicable as I begin work with this particular client.
This is the Transactional Analysis Podcast. Conversations on the theory, application, and spirit of TA, sponsored by the International Transactional Analysis Association and the European Association for Transactional Analysis. In this episode, we chat with James Longwell, a provisional teaching and supervising transactional analyst in the organisational field and an organisational development consultant for Google. James discusses the importance of understanding the system and culture of an organisation when working as an internal practitioner, how TA has enhanced his effectiveness in his various roles, and how it informs his ability to focus on the system, the group, and the individuals in an organisation, supporting them to achieve their objectives and thrive in a changing environment. We also chat about AI and the roles it can play in TA training and work in general. We hope you enjoy.
James, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's great to have you. To get us started off, you might introduce yourselves to our listeners. Tell them who you are, where you come from, your roles in the TA world.
Yeah, sure. Happy to do that. So my name is James Longwell. I consider myself a bit of a multicultural kid because I was born in the Netherlands to English parents, although I think there's a bit of Franco-German blood in there as well, and raised entirely in Scotland. And I've lived overseas in Singapore and Australia. So, you know, one of the things that's really important to me is kind of multicultural appreciation. I'm a PTSTA in the organisational field, probably about 3 years into my contract. And what I do in my day job is I'm an organisation development consultant for Google in the Europe, Middle East and Africa region. And whilst we're on Google, I am required by Google's PR team to state that I am speaking on my own behalf and I am not acting as a spokesperson for Google in any manner or form during this conversation.
Thanks, James. So you're a PTSTA in the organizational field and you work for Google. So that makes you a employed transactional analyst. Does it? Is that what you'd categorize yourself as?
Yeah, no, I suppose it does. And there's two different things here, I suppose. One is that when I am working as an organizational development consultant or practitioner in Google, I am utilizing transactional analysis and I have a separate supervisor for that work that I do to my PTSTA work, which is obviously done outside of Google. So yes, I've got two role worlds that I occupy in terms of how I leverage and use TA.
Very good. So what's your TA story? How did you find it? How did you come across it?
Well, I'm now showing my age. So in 1997, I entered the workforce after graduating with a degree in chemistry, which was clearly never going to be my forte at all. And I entered the human resources profession. And I started working for the French car manufacturer Peugeot. In those days, they offered us professional skills, professional development training. Early courses that I took about a month into this job was about communication skills. And underpinning that communication skills program was the idea of ego states. Little did I realize how significant that would become, but the metaphor really stuck in my mind as I was entering that workplace. And I think then over the years, I got exposed to a few different bits of TA through my organizational training and work until eventually I decided to start full-time training in 2013. But again, that was a bit of an accident. Someone said, come and try out a TA 101. And instead of going to a TA 101, I signed up for a foundation and then did a written TA 101 instead. Wow. So I jumped in with both feet and didn't look back.
It's really interesting how that seems to happen in the organizational world. People come across bits of theory, don't they? They seem to be all over the place. And then occasionally people will pull them together and realize they want to do some training in TA. So yeah, brilliant.
And that was absolutely where I was at as well. It was like I've had lots of in-house training with my various employers, but I felt like I was it was like peanut butter. It was spread very thinly and I really wanted something with some depth. Not that I knew at that stage when I started the foundation that TA would offer me that depth. I subsequently discovered it had the depth, which was wonderful. But that was my thinking when I started my TA training.
Great. Love it.
So what do you think about the depth now?
Well, now I look at it and I go, what I really love about TA is that it has this breadth in terms of the fields, and it has real theoretical depth. And the theoretical depth goes back beyond TA into the psychology of Freud, or in fact, you could even take it further back, because Byrne was incredibly well read, Greek myths and legends, just such a huge array of sources. If you ever look in his bibliographies and any of his books, he was so well read. And that's what I love about TA, is that it's a very multidisciplinary way of thinking about psychology in the world. And that's something I find particularly attractive. And the fact that it's still being developed. It hasn't stood still. New theory is being developed all the time.
Great. Yeah, I'm similar. I love that about TA, and the fact that there are new opinions and new theories that are coming out that conflict or contradict old ones. And there's wrestling with the theory as well. And there's an openness to that. I really like that.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
How does this depth, this multidimensional aspect that TA offers become relevant in organizations and to the role that you do?
What it does is I think it gives me a consistent underpinning frame of reference about how to do my job. And I've had exposure to like organization development training programs, and they tend to be a bit like tapas. They pick from lots of different authors, but you don't get something that has this consistent, coherent kind of underpinning way of thinking about it. So in the organizational field, as in all the fields, there is this lovely way of being able to pull together all the red threads and to walk into any client encounter in any type of situation and go, wow, I've got all this multitude of TA thinking that I can draw upon. I'm not following a formula. It's like what seems most relevant, most applicable as I begin work with this particular client.
When you say it gives you an underpinning to do your work, what are you saying in that? Because I'm conscious that will make sense to you, and to some extent it'll make sense to Matt and I. And I also think that there may be people out there listening who are like, yeah, but what does the organizational field actually do? Like, what's the nuts and bolts of it? Because therapy and counseling can seem somewhat tangible to people, but an organizational transactional analyst, I mean, people have often said to me, oh, you must work in finance.
Yes.
It has that dash to it.
No, I love that question. So one of we can think about each of the fields as having a sort of a purpose, if you like. And with the organizational field, it's about establishing a contract for change within the organization. Now, that change could be in any sector. It could be a charity, it could be a non-governmental organization, it could be private sector. But all organizations, and Byrne said this himself, all organizations want to survive and they want to thrive. And change is an essential way of organizations thriving or surviving. Now, I know change is a much used word, so we need to unpack that word change. But I suppose what I'm saying is no organization stays static, just like no human being stays static. So TA in the organizational field is about supporting the organization with whatever it has articulated it wants to grow or change in the way that it operates in whatever its marketplace or situation or context might be. It really is that kind of broad. Now, I can bring it close to home in the sort of work that I do. I will often be asked in by leaders within Google, can you help us with a change in strategy? Or can you help us? We're combining two teams and bringing them together. We don't know what the impact's going to be. So in organizational TA, there's usually an organizational starting question. That's the commencement of the work. And then very similar to what would happen in other fields in TA, we then begin the work of contracting, which is about establishing usually a multi-party agreement in the organizational world. It's very rarely two-way. There are usually many, many players in an organizational contract for change.
Yeah. So I'm hearing from that is that the client is the organization.
Yes.
And there may be people you're interacting with, but they're representing the organization rather than necessarily themselves. And there could be a thought process from people, oh, well, TA comes from psychotherapy and it's about personal change. So if you're working in an organization, it must be about facilitating change at a personal level, but for people in their professional roles. So what would you say to that? Because that's quite different from what you've just said, right?
Well, I think I can connect them. Now, I would say that there are different kind of philosophies around organizational TA, and the frame that I hold is very much one that's the systemic frame. And in plain English, what I mean by that is I start with the system first. So what is this system about? What does it exist to do? What are the properties of the system? How does it structure itself? What patterns do we see playing out? All of that gets presented in the client that sits in front of me. So whenever I meet a new client internally for the first time, the first thing I'm doing is establishing where are they in the system? What pressures are they subject to? What is it they're being asked to enact or implement on behalf of the organization? And so, yes, I'm working with individuals, but I'm always working with individuals in their context of whatever it is they do in the system. And yes, I can bring in the ideas that might originate in earlier TA thinking around increasing their autonomy, increasing their resources, increasing their adult ego state, but it's all in support of them achieving something within the system, whatever the system's need to change or grow is.
Interesting.
So I'm curious about what theories there are in TA that would support that kind of work, especially around systems. So as a psychotherapist, I focus in on individuals, or sometimes work with couples or maybe families, but you're talking about a much wider and broader system. So what kind of theories do you particularly enjoy working with?
Well, in the organizational field, the origins are all in the structures and dynamics of organizations and groups, which was Byrne's book on systems, on cultures.
Yeah.
And so in there, Byrne has got various ways of describing systems and cultures. I haven't yet talked about culture, but systems always have a culture. Yeah. So that's one part of it. And in that book, he would also describe the features and phenomenons of groups, which would be imago theory, for example. And then yes, individuals obviously participate in those systems as well. Byrne would be talking about things like the group forces, which is about the external pressure that comes onto groups that exist within systems.
Yeah.
But that book would be the origin in TA of how we would think systemically about systems, cultures, groups.
Brilliant.
I have to say, I must put a little bit of a health warning on that particular book. It's not particularly well edited. So it's not the kind of book that, you pick up at the airport and you could have a flick through during your holiday.
I have tried.
I would say I far more recommend it's a great book to dip into.
Okay. Read
4 or 5 pages and go, wow, there's always some new insight that pops out. But yeah, strongly do not recommend reading it cover to cover. It's not going to work.
So I guess this is some of the reason why TA even has an organizational field, right? Is that right from the get-go, Byrne was not just interested in psychotherapy, but actually was casting his own academic and intellectual net much wider and had an interest in systems, in groups, in organizations, in leadership, and in understanding how these things operate. So I suppose in some ways you could say that TA was never just a psychotherapy once he wrote that book. Would that be fair to say, James?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, what we need to remember is that before Byrne wrote explicitly about TA, he was working in the US Army. Then much of his work was in hospitals. Yeah. So he was very exposed to systems and organizations and groups in a lot of his work. And of course, the origins of TA was a group therapy originally. I mean, I know that in many parts of the world, there's much more emphasis on it being an individual therapy now, but originally it was a group therapy. So yes, I think all of that influenced it. And also I think what's significant is that it wasn't too long after Byrne started to write his books that a number of people in Byrne circles started to talk about, wait, this is relevant in organizations. We can apply these ideas here as well.
Yes. So from my frame of reference, when I think about organizational TA, I think about being an organizational consultant, maybe a trainer inside an organization, a coach, maybe a manager. And often when I think of those, for some reason in my head, at least anyway, I think of people outside the organization going in. Now, some of the reason, full disclosure, is because that's what I used to do in a past life as career, is be an external contractor. So I very much have come at TA from that angle myself. But you're not an external contractor. You were employed by a company and using TA. So that must have a different feel to how you operate.
Yes, it does. I mean, I think what I would say about that is that it's probably the model you've just described, John, is far more common. And I think the reason it's far more common is that it's like, how do I maintain, well, how am I able to maintain my adult ego state as I do this work? And we introject systems just like we introject other influences. We introject systems and we introject cultures.
Can I just ask a quick question? This is for those who haven't heard that term before. Can you explain how we might introject? They may have heard about introjecting other people into our psyche, but can you explain that other systems piece?
Yes. So there's a number of authors that talk about this, but you could have a look at Pearl Drago, for example, if people want to follow up, who talks about the cultural parent. And so in the same vein where we could be very influenced by a parental figure or a figure of authority, we could be influenced by religion. Yeah. We could be influenced by national culture. And actually, when we enter the workplace, we could be really influenced by our first employer as this is the way things get done. Yeah. And then it gets templated, for want of a better expression, in our parent ego state, and then perhaps becomes unhelpful. That's the idea of the introject. And with organizational cultures, they can be really powerful. They can offer lots of hypnosis in a way, and people might not realize what the features of the culture are. And so to link that back to John's question, when you work as an internal practitioner, it's like I have to earth myself every day. It's like, where's my adult ego state? What is it about this culture that I'm not noticing when I'm doing this work so that I can remain potent and effective? Right. But on the other hand, being an in-house practitioner means that a whole bunch of context that is very difficult for outsiders to understand, I have access to. And in some ways, it means that I can do my work more effectively. The other thing I would say is that often in my assignments that I receive internally, I might be expected to resolve a client assignment in under 2 weeks. So I'm often working at speed with not a lot of time because that's all the leader can allocate to do the work. And so being in-house means that all of that context and background can in a way be short-circuited.
Yeah, you can hit the ground running. You don't have to, the usual things for an external contractor, sign the contract, get a login, get a laptop, get a pass for the site. You're there, ready and available.
Yeah, all of the above. Yeah.
And I'd imagine normally you'd have to attempt to become as familiar with the culture as possible, being an outsider, whereas you don't have to do that at Google.
Yeah. Now, there is an opposite to this, which is how challenging can you be? And in TA, we talk about the idea of a confrontation. I mean, in layman's language, to put in front of, to present something to someone that's incongruent. As an outsider, maybe it's easier. And the important thing for me is I have to have a very low fear of getting sacked in order to be an effective transactional analyst. And that may not be so comfortable earlier in your career. I've kind of, as I approach the half century, I'm like, I don't care. What's more important is the work and the honest feedback to the client around what I've discovered in whatever client assignment I've taken on. The other thing that I benefit from is that Google does not impose any operating framework or any OD philosophy on me. I am free to use my transactional analysis perspectives in the work that I do. And I realize that's a real privilege.
Yeah. I was going to ask you that actually, because obviously, we're saying you're an employed transactional analyst, but that's not your job title. You're an employed OD consultant who's using transactional analyst, and you happen to be a certified and a provisional teaching and supervising one. But I was curious about how they perceive TA and you using it, or if there has been any discussions about that.
Yeah, I am careful because I think I don't want to come across as the kind of presenting that TA is the only answer or the only way of looking at a situation. So someone once said something to me very wise, which was, you will know you're developing as a transactional analyst when in an organizational setting, you can translate TA into the language of your client. Now, that doesn't mean that I never use TA phraseology or TA words. I do, but I am careful about when I use those and introduce those. And it's almost always on the basis of what you might call psychoeducation. If I can't introduce an idea in less than 10 minutes and then have the client pick it up and use it and for it to become helpful to them, then I've been sharing it for me, not for them. So that's the test I kind of do with myself around how explicit I am. And yes, people inside Google know that I'm a transactional analyst, and they will ask, does TA offer anything with this particular problem? And if I'm asked a question like that, then of course I'm more than happy to share.
Yeah, I really like that. I think as a TA practitioner, you don't necessarily have to communicate all of your theory in order for your work to be effective in any field. But yeah, that does make sense. Wanted to just ask a quick question. You guys in the organizational field talking about OD, can you just let us know what OD is?
Yes, yeah. There's two things that OD can mean. One is organization design, which is the very explicit kind of how do you structure an organization to deliver its objectives?
Yeah.
I mean, what most people would think is that's the organogram or the structure chart.
Yeah.
The other type of OD, which is what my job title is organization development.
Okay.
And that would be very similar to what we would say the purpose of the organizational field and transactional analysis is, which is about securing a contract for change in the organization. And whatever the organization is trying to achieve, organization development helps leaders work towards it, if you like.
Can I ask a quick question? Do you think then that transactional analysis has enabled you to be a more effective executive?
Without hesitation, yes. However, the reason I would say that, it's two things.
Yeah.
It's the personal development that I went through, my own process of learning TA, which included, learning about TA theory, therapy, supervision, the whole package that I went through, which helped me grow as a practitioner.
Yeah.
All of those components together, I think, are what makes the difference with how I show up. But I would say I've hugely transformed in my impact as a practitioner compared to before starting TA.
Great answer.
So I'm conscious that Google is a global tech giant. This must influence the nature of your work in some way. And I'm wondering, what does organizational TA have to offer technology, or vice versa?
Yeah, that's such an interesting question. I think Google has a hiring philosophy, which is about, it looks at a number of kind of rubrics for how it hires people. Leadership, Googliness, which is a sort of a word that doesn't necessarily mean much, but I would say it broadly equates to being collaborative and being able to get on with other people. So there's a number of elements that Google focuses on. That's often where I'm called in. It's not a problem with the product or the output that they want to produce. It's more usually a challenge with the how. And so very often I'm called in to work with groups of leaders who are struggling with how to make a particular change. There'll be no one in that team that doesn't have the technical expertise to implement whatever AI, artificial intelligence feature it is they want to develop. It will be, how do we get all these different teams to mesh together and work towards producing that output?
So that's an interesting point, given what's happening in the world right now about AI and people, throwing up all sorts of queries about, can AI replace coaches? Can AI replace therapists?
Yes.
What can it replace? And can it replace you?
Well, Google's version of AI is called Gemini. And 4 months ago, I asked Gemini how confident it was that it could do my job. I don't know whether it was just saying something to please me or to be diplomatic, but it said to me, at this stage, I am not capable of the fine judgment of human nuance that is necessary to do your job. But I can help you with lots of stuff behind the scenes in terms of reading materials, assembling, like synthesizing and analyzing documents, etc. So that's the situation today. Really? I think what we need to come back to is to remember that what large language models do, which is the jargon for what the AI products that we see on the marketplace today, what they do is they are incredibly good at synthesizing vast amounts of information. So right now, at this stage, AI is capable of ingesting every single piece of TA writing that has ever been produced, and being able to, we could then ask the AI any question about any aspect of theory. So you could create those models in ChatGPT and Gemini that were specifically orientated towards TA. What those models would be less good at, though, would be sort of discerning or choosing between which of these pieces of theory are most impactful in day-to-day client work or interactions. The AI can't help us with that. So the good news for all of us transactional analysts is that AI is not yet an adult ego state, or it's only a very small part of the adult ego state. The finest kind of aspect of the adult ego state, which is that, very much thinking about the kind of the integrating version of the adult ego state, which Tudor talks about, that is so human. And I think we are a very long way from AI being able to emulate that at the moment.
Interesting. So. I heard someone say, it was Daniel Priestley actually, who's a business coach. I heard him say that AI is good at content, whereas humans are great at context.
Yes.
And they can't do the context piece yet.
Yeah. Now, there's all sorts of frontiers in this, like the advent of quantum computing, which will massively open up the processing power. Who knows where we'll get to at the moment? But I think what I say to anyone that I work with on the teams that I work with, you should use the same amount of discernment and adult ego state as you would interacting with AI, as you would in any other walk of life. Never accept at face value what it's telling you. Always verify, always go back and check your sources. So I maintain a healthy skepticism in my interactions with AI, but it's no doubt it's a huge productivity enhancer.
So there's two parts to that I'm thinking of now. There's the transactional analysis part more generally, like in terms of kind of support learning and of TA, for example, and that. And then there's the bit of you in your role inside a tech company that is developing AI. And I suppose they're maybe two sides of the same coin. Is this a central part of your role now as an OD consultant inside a tech company?
Yes. So I'm supporting leaders who are implementing. There is nothing that Google does these days that doesn't have an AI dimension or an AI angle to it. So it's present in every single piece of client work I do. Now, obviously, if you're an engineer leading an AI development team, that's rather different to someone who might be selling AI products, but nevertheless, it's very present. Internally, we've been encouraged to experiment. And I would say the huge transformation that I've experienced in my role in the past year is going from, so this is quite a trivial example, but asking an AI to produce a pairing schedule for a training program that made sure that every person spoke to every other person. I literally had to wrestle with AI for 2 or 3 hours a year ago to get it to do that. Now it would produce that in the blink of an eye. Through to now, what I'm doing is anything that generates large outputs. So let's say an internal survey or a transcription of a one-to-one conversation. I will now upload the one-to-one transcript of the conversation to the AI. I will anonymize it before it goes in so that it doesn't have any identifying features. And then I will use the AI to help me do my job much more quickly in terms of analyzing what's said in that. Now, and then I will go back into the AI though, and I will say, I don't agree with your analysis here. You've overemphasized this, you've underemphasized this. And what about this component? So I train it, I teach it. But one thing is quite funny, John, is that I do have to check myself. I go, this is not human. It's very interesting what happens in your internal process around, gosh, I am so polite to the AI. Why am I so polite? Why is that please people that I have in my drivers coming to the surface?
Do you know what though?
My interactions with the AI, it's not necessary.
I heard Mo Gordat, who used to work at Google, say we need to be polite to it because we're training it.
Well, that's
and
true.
So
yes, that's
why
fair.
not train it to be polite?
That's fair.
And I'm also thinking about us being transactional analysts and the concept of interjects like we were talking about earlier, and the potential for AI to have us all as interjects of a form. I totally realize that it's not a sentient thing, by the way. So I'm stretching it a bit here.
Yeah.
But I'm interested in this idea of, is there a danger if we are not an adult when we're training it and giving it feedback, that this is going to in some way create unhelpful occurrences?
Yeah, I mean, we're a long way from AI being a fully developed kind of technology in that sense. You have the AI phenomenon of hallucinations, which occurs across any AI product at the moment, where it will generate ideas or sources that don't exist. So there's no AI that's immune to that at the moment, for example. What becomes really important, and this is beyond my technical knowledge, is how you train the AI data sets and check them for bias. That's what's really important in this. So the more robust your testing processes are, and that's honestly why it's taken a while for these products to come to marketplace, because people need to be sure that they're going to show up in a way that isn't insulting or offensive or so on. But I think what I would say to everyone is AI is here to stay. It is not going to be rolled back. It is going to be a feature of our technological lives. And so in the same way that we were encouraged as employees of Google, just get out there, experiment, test it. That's what I would say to the transactional analysis community. Get out there and play with the AIs, just see what it can do and use it to be in service to you. That's the most important thing.
Yeah, interesting point, because, there's a possibility, like with anything new, when new things happen, when evolution moves forward, that a certain cohort will become compliance resistant.
Yes.
As transactional analysts, we theorize that in a certain way to understand the behavior, and we know it to be an effective or less effective way of working. So the idea is, well, what would be effective is to, like you said, be curious, check it out, engage with it, find ways of using it that work for you. I would say I'm dipping my toe in the water, but I on at least once a day at the moment open Google Gemini and ask it to do something for me.
And we mustn't, I think it's really important that we hang on to some of the principles that we have in the TA community. We are able to critique. We're able to look at different theory. And I think it's exactly the same with AI. We maintain a productive skepticism. We keep our wits about us in terms of our adult ego state and think in that way. That would be my encouragement. Yeah. If we become kind of just like enslaved to the AI, so unhelpful.
Can I ask, have you got any tips in terms of how to engage with AI that you think would be most effective or more effective?
Yeah. Interestingly, it's about being as specific as possible.
Yeah.
Which is not, so the more generic your inquiry is to an AI, the more generic your output will be coming back. But let's say that I was like, I'd like a poem about TA, and I'd like it in the style of Rabbie Burns, and I'd like it to cover functional fluency. You could go and do that experiment if you want. You would be astonished how precise the outputs are. So the more that you can drill in with what your requirements are, the better the models tend to respond. The other thing you can do, which is really helpful, is if you're working on a project and you're gathering research, AIs can become very helpful. There's a particular product Google has called Notebook LM, but there are other ones that are equivalent. Other products are available. But what Notebook LM allows you to do is to gather all your sources and then do multiple inquiries on the sources in terms of what's there, where do writers contradict each other, where do ideas support each other, etc. So you've got ways of actually accessing data. And when I was preparing my first 101 this year, it was so helpful to just be able to do that, to navigate across all my sources. So it becomes a supporter of our outputs, not a threat. That's how I experienced it.
Great.
I wonder if a useful reframe would be to call it assistive intelligence rather than artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
I wonder if it's the artificial thing that really puts people off, because I definitely don't have positive connotations of the word artificial. Everything that pops into my mind when I hear artificial is like, no, don't want that.
Look at our very field here, though, transactional analysis. It's like, I still struggle to even say the words.
Yeah.
And it's like the most unfriendly combination of words. You wouldn't think that transactional analysis was a human psychology. Based on those words, you'd think it was something to do with financial instruments. So yeah, no, I agree. It's interesting, though, how language works. In particular, machine learning and artificial intelligence were actually phrases that were coined decades ago. And then get fixed in the lexicon, just like we have a lexicon in TA.
Yeah.
I'm going to try and make assistive intelligence work.
Copyright. Interesting. One of the things that I heard is that you can ask it to take on a role. So somebody said, act as my CTO. and produce heads of terms for a deal, and then create an email in this particular, as if you're running this role. And that can be a helpful thing to do. Not something I've attempted yet.
For entrepreneurs or people who are starting their own businesses, I think it's actually a wonderful aid to economic growth and prosperity, because things that you might not be expert in, you can have the AI help you be more productive. So if technology is not your thing, just as you've described, Matt, they could help you do that.
So can I ask, as a transactional analyst, what have you learned yourself? How has it helped you to be a better transactional analyst? Or has it changed the way in which you approach your work in any way?
Yeah, certainly in my internal client work in Google, it's certainly changed how I do some of that. Now, in terms of how I might think about the client and using all the TA maps, and in terms of contracting, no, that's my core underpinning TA training that is still like front and center. But in terms of the detail of the client work and sorting out information, categorizing sources, making sure that my thinking is robust, I would say that has really enhanced my practice as a practitioner. Similarly, actually, when working as a PTSTA, in terms of, particularly if I want to check sources of particular TA thinkers or writers, I might upload all the relevant documents, and I might then use the summaries to help me make sure that I've ticked off different parts of a curriculum. So I would say it's enhanced how I do my roles, but not revolutionized.
It can support, I guess, can't it, with some of that bulk analysis that might otherwise be very manual. Not the transactional analysis that we are talking about here, but actually some of the sifting through information, condensing down.
Yes.
That's what it's really good at, you know? Yeah. It's like, why read a 25-page transcript of a conversation when you can give it to AI and ask it to summarize it for you?
No, exactly that. Or one of my favorite TA theories is role theory by Bernd Schmidt. The article is not always the easiest to read. And so if I'm going to be teaching that, I want a quick reminder of role contamination, role confusion, then why would I not use AI to help me refresh and make sure that the teaching points are close to the surface and accessible to me? I don't see that as cheating in any way. It's a source that I've used before. It's a source I want to come back to. So, and I'm still learning how to incorporate it in the work that I do.
Brilliant.
We've talked a lot about the organisational field, James, because that's your field.
Yeah.
And we have talked a little bit about TA training generally, but how do you think AI might support the other fields of application?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I think, so let's start with the education field. I think if you take schools and universities, they're going to be much more cautious in the application of AI because of the threat of plagiarism. And interestingly, I think our schools and universities need to be preparing people for a workplace of the future, which is going to prominently use AI. So I think, for example, educational transactional analysts need to have an awareness of what these AI products are going to do and hopefully use them in a similar, because as a PTSTA, that's an educational role. Yes. So I would hope that educational transactional analysts will be able to use that in a similar way. If I go to psychotherapy, I know that in the US, there's some services now which are kind of online psychotherapy. And I have to say, I have a bit more of a skepticism about an algorithm playing that role. And whilst I say that, at the same time, we know that there are some generational truths that, like the Gen Zs of the world, actually prefer interacting through a mobile device on a text-based manner. They find it far less threatening and far more accessible. So I don't understand that. I don't relate to that, but I have to recognize I'm Gen X. That's not my way of interacting in the world.
Interesting you say that. We just did an interview with Linda Gillum, and that's one of the roles that she had when in the lockdown. She's a TA counsellor, and she was using text backwards and forwards in an effective way to support people with their mental health.
Yes. So do I think the gold standard in psychotherapy is still the face-to-face interaction, whether it be online with a real human being? Absolutely, I do. And we have to recognize that society has reshaped things around us with regards to how technology gets used and utilized and implemented. So it's, I don't have an answer to that. I'm not deep enough into that field. I'm more of an observer. It raises a really interesting kind of question.
I think on the surface, a little bit like we were just saying, it being an assistant, those things that are available now, if you're working virtually around, it can give you feedback about who's doing the bulk of the talking, what the percentage breakdown is. Are you doing more? Is the client doing less? It can maybe take a transcript and give you a summary afterwards for your own notes. Those sorts of assistive aspects may be useful for psychotherapists. So again, maybe it's about looking at it from that point of view about how it could assist the individual rather than necessarily replace. I think that's the key takeaway I'm taking from this conversation anyway, is like see it as a companion, as something that can support you.
Yeah. And talking about the counselling field, because I wouldn't want to leave this podcast thinking, well, James didn't even mention the counselling field. Not at all. I want to honour all the fields. One of the aspects I understand about the counselling field is it's like, how do you resource people? How do you resource the adult ego state? And certainly I think AI could be a very good way of providing resources or ideas to people in different situations, not to, again, replace human beings, but it's like, how might I do this? What might be some self-reflection questions I could ask myself to help me in this situation? So for when the people aren't in psychological crisis, but need some sort of support, maybe that would be an angle as well.
Okay, so James, we've zoomed around lots of different elements of your role and obviously what's emerging in regards to AI. What for you is the kind of central thread through all of this in relation to being an organisational transactional analyst?
Yeah. So what I would come back to is the system. And an organisational transactional analyst is always working at the system, the group, and the individual level. So we move back and forth through those layers depending on who the client is, what the ask is, what part of the system we need to interact with. And Byrne's original ideas from the structures and dynamics still provide a really rich guide to that. And we, as in organizational transactional analysts, integrate a whole bunch of other TA ideas and then give them an organizational spin in terms of its application. And I mean, I would say to anyone that's listening, very happy to get into conversation with anyone about my frame of reference on organizational TA or any aspect of TA and AI, which I think I need to write a TAJ article about.
It sounds like it.
That's exactly what I was thinking. And I was also thinking that's a great pitch for organizational TA. You've got my interest piqued even more than ever. So thank you.
Thanks, James.
As always, if you found anything in today's episode interesting, please feel free to reach out. You can visit our website, which has lots of information and resources, tapodcast.com. You can connect with us on all major platforms such as Instagram, LinkedIn, and Facebook. And you can email us at info@tapodcast.com. If you aren't already, please follow us wherever you get your podcast from. And we would really appreciate a review on the platform you're listening on as well. It helps raise the profile of the podcast and TA. Thanks for listening. This episode is sponsored by the International Transactional Analysis Association and the European Association for Transactional Analysis. You can find more information on the ITAA at www.itaaworld.org/ITAA membership-benefits. You can find more information on IATA at www.eatanews.org.